In this case, I'm talking about something that's fairly ordinary, very familiar, something that we do without really thinking about, making phone calls. So by focusing on this very quotidian activity, we can see how different writers are giving increasingly interesting depth to human connections. Because after all, what is a phone for? It's there to create a connection, isn't it, between people? It's for the purposes of communication. And what we're looking at is the way in which these texts explore that theme of communication amongst others. There are a variety of other themes that do come through too. We can keep those in mind. For example, in Soyinka's poem, we notice the theme of racial discrimination being a very unpleasant theme that surfaced in the course of that poem. That wasn't the case, though, in the second text we read, which was last week, called The Phone Call. I want to focus on this idea of communication as a general, overarching issue that is characteristic in all of these texts. And another thing to keep in mind, too, is how this will shape our homework response, this theme of communication, or the lack of it, frankly speaking. In the first text, Phone Call, we were exploring the way in which things like the technical features, such as the use of caesura, juxtaposed with enjambement, the repetition, the short fragmentary phrases, as well as other things such as the tonal shifts. These all shaped how we understood the interaction between human beings. We understood the issue of communication and its weaknesses. In fact, in many respects, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's its failure. It's an irony, isn't it? We speak, on the phone in this case, we speak, all right. And the purpose is to communicate, to literally translate what's going on in our minds into somebody else's mind so that they can understand, hopefully, again, a complete access to what it is we want to say, what we feel. So we have limited ways of doing that, don't we? We can't employ telepathy. Might be a good thing, might not. We can't read each other's minds. So the only thing we've got is what we can say orally or what we can write. And this is an enduring theme that has preoccupied writers for quite a long time, centuries, we could say. It became particularly important in the last century, where writers were experimenting in the early part of that century and perhaps the late part of the 19th century. They were experimenting with different ways of communicating and different problems associated with communication. So we'll bear that in mind. One thing I'd like to notice, though, is apart from what I mentioned a moment ago about the form, the style of texts like the poem, Telephone Conversation, we also looked at the short narrative, The Phone Call. And if you recall, that narrative was really characterized by a considerable absence of imagery, of decorative language. It wasn't really appealing to our senses in any way. There was no really dynamic or dramatic or vivid descriptive language at all. Did you recall that in that text we read last week? It was really pretty much written in simple form, plain sentences with one or two ideas in them. That meant then that really we needed to step back from the text and ask ourselves why. Because in that text, we tended to find that it was ultimately rather didactic. I mean, you could say that all good literature is really somewhat didactic, isn't it? What does that word mean again, Thomas? Didactic? Big there, Thomas. Come on, you've had it before. Didactic, Troy.
It means like tending to teach a lesson or like giving a moral.
Yes, that's right. There is an intention there to teach us something, to instruct, to perhaps morally guide in some ways. In the last story, we saw that it was really pared down. It was stripped down to pretty much bare, simple, literal language. And that tended to emphasize, in many regards, the more didactic quality of the text. And if it was tending to teach, by the way, which we've perhaps agreed upon now, what was it teaching us, this text last week? Any ideas? The phone call. Yes, Troy.
Is it like that, like if we have anything that's like bothering us, we can't keep it to ourselves. Like we have to do something about it.
That's a very good point. It was definitely part of the narrative intention, I think, because our young man, the boy in the story who was going to school and who had this distance, if you like, with his father, he'd more or less kept this inside himself. He'd rather suppressed it. But in the end, he actually voiced it, didn't he? He gave voice to his feelings. He communicated them to his father. So in the end, yes, it was about the importance of being able to express what troubles us or oppresses us and the problems associated with not expressing those feelings and thoughts and ideas. There were a few other issues coming forward. I mean, obviously, this was a story that dealt with relationships, particularly, of course, the relationship within a family of father and son. It perhaps looked at the more didactic dimension there, at the necessity for parents to take on more responsibility, perhaps to give more time to their children. In an age when we are frequently pressed for time, it becomes increasingly difficult to find that time to spend on the ones that we really are supposed to love. That's a theme that really isn't necessarily terribly modern, but it still has become, I think, a more of a concern in the way in which families can often find themselves lacking this necessary communication. There are other themes at work as well, but yes, it was a story that by its style, because of that rather, I said pared down, that means stripped down, rather simple and direct, it tended to shift away from being more of a story and more from being a lesson to us. Now, I want to look at this story, phone call by Berton, Roueché, and we'll see how there are similar elements as well as very different elements in the narrative approach. What you'll need to do in your own narratives is to ensure that, yes, number one, you are engaging your reader through your style. That means all of the techniques that we are constantly studying and attempting to enlist in our own writing. But on the other hand, you might want to consider whether your narrative can offer a lesson without being too obvious. You don't want to be too pedantic about it or too overt about it. What does that word mean again, please, Sebastian? Overt?
Overt, I think it means not clear.
Well, actually, it kind of means the opposite. It means obvious. And the antonym for that would be covert, which means hidden or secret. Now, in this case, I want to look at this narrative, and I want you to consider how you can absorb all of the lessons from the last 2 weeks and today's lesson, these 3 lessons in terms of their exploration of the theme of communication or its lack, and how you can adopt some of the technical features that we've discussed so far. So let's start reading this story, Phone Call by Berton Roueché. Okay, my first reader will be Elsa. Just read the first paragraph and then pause, please.